Well, Luke, it's nice to be back here in Amsterdam, and it's good to see you in person again.
Great to have you.
So you lead KPMG Tax and Legal's ESG service offering. Let's just take a step back. Why is this so important today?
Yeah, a very relevant question indeed. And of course, we all know that climate change has a big impact on all of us. And we all know that the tax and legal, for that matter, could be an instrument to change behavior. And I think that's why for tax and legal, it's very important to understand what's happening and how could we, as also tax professionals, help indeed to mitigate climate change.
That's really interesting, Luke. And when you talk to clients in the tax or legal spaces, what are people focused on the most at the moment?
Yeah, there are a couple of topics. I would say a few are quite obvious for the tax departments. To give you an example, that's, for instance, addressing tax transparency and tax reporting. So being open and transparent about your tax policy, about where you pay tax, how much tax is being paid. So basically, tax transparency in general. We see a lot of regulations popping up in the EU public CBCR in the next couple of years. In Australia, regulations around this topic. So that's a topic where tax departments already focus on quite a bit, but we still see basically needs for support in this area. The other topic, maybe less known for the tax function, is the E of ESG, the environmental stuff. So basically focusing on all the green taxes. And we've seen quite substantial regulations popping up in the EU with the EU Green Deal, with the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, with the Emissions Trading System, the Energy Taxation Directive, and many countries initiate ESG regulations, either grants, incentives, or tax regulations. Well, we have the US Inflation Reduction Act, which clearly has a big impact on multinationals as well, in order to determine where to make investments in the area of sustainability and ESG. So that's another area where maybe tax departments need to focus on more than they have been doing so far. But sometimes this is embedded in other functions within the corporate. So these are two big pillars, but there's more.
I was going to ask about that, Luke, because I can imagine some of those green taxes like the Carbon Border Adjustment Tax. Sometimes those could easily slip between the cracks between various functions
Exactly.
in the company. So it's good. And how are you seeing, if at all, people changing their thinking around ESG?
Well, when we started having conversations with, let's say, the tax teams at larger multinationals, or with the finance functions where there is no tax team, then clearly there was some attention, but largely around, let's say, tax transparency. In terms of the environmental taxes, green taxes, sometimes this was embedded in other functions within the corporate. We have, for instance, conversations with corporate affairs teams who focus on ESG investments and want to understand where they can benefit from new regulations, either grants, incentives, or where they could or should, let's say, minimize risks in terms of the regulations that have been popping up. So it's different disciplines, and we see that now tax departments understand that they need to take some form of responsibility. And to your point about, for instance, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, we actually help clients also to develop RACI models. Where should tax be involved? Where should the procurement team or the supply chain team be involved? Because it is, like with customs or with VAT, it's sometimes embedded in different functions rather than just taxation.
So it really is a whole of company type initiative that people need.
Exactly. And what we recommend tax departments or heads of tax to really talk to their sustainability team, their ESG team, just to understand where they could help and where they should basically get involved in order to mitigate risk or generate opportunities for the business.
So that's really interesting, Luke. And so that actually brings me on to another question I had for you, which is for folk that perhaps haven't started thinking about this space at all, for the right at the start, what sort of advice would you have for those folk today?
Well, the first thing I would advise them is to have conversations within their company to understand where sustainability is embedded, also to understand what is the purpose of the company itself in terms of meeting their sustainability goals, and then get a conversation around the specific topics, because sometimes the tax function could contribute, as I mentioned earlier, in order to achieve certain goals by grants, incentives, but also mitigating risks by making sure that, for instance, their supply chain is well prepared in terms of, for instance, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that will be introduced. So having those conversations is definitely the starting point. And of course, we can always help them in giving that sort of overview. Our website, for that matter, is already providing with a lot of information around this topic, and they could start there as well.
That's KPMG's ESG website.
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. Yeah. So that's a lot to think about. And you started off with transparency, which of course everyone's starting to get up the curve because that's coming down very fast. But you're right, a lot of people forget about that E point, and there's all of these green taxes and such, and those can be really expensive if you're not paying attention to them.
Exactly. And I think that the tax function needs to be involved. I mentioned that tax is an instrument to change behavior, and that's the way governments, of course, see it as well, and they introduce new regulations. We, within KPMG, for instance, developed an ESG database currently covering like 80 countries with all ESG regulations included. And it's enormous what is there, and new regulations, existing regulations, and companies need to understand that they need to get involved on those topics.
Well, daunting, but we've got a website, so this has been fascinating, Luke. Thank you for your time. Clearly a topic that, if not at the top of people's minds today, will very, very shortly be, because it's coming down the pike fast. So thank you, Peter.
You're welcome. Thank you, Robbie.